I was standing at the window of my brother's study the morning he signed the contract, and I can tell you, though I have been a witness to many things in my life, many moments I would not have believed had I not seen them with my own eyes, I have never felt a room go so completely, so utterly still. Edmund did not look up from the paper. His pen moved with the same deliberate economy he brought to every document, every deed, every correspondence that crossed his desk. The scratching of the nib was the only sound. Lord Caro, who sat across from him, a florid man with watery eyes and the look of someone who had been too long in the sun and not nearly long enough in the company of honest accounts, kept wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, a habit I had noticed him exercising throughout the 40 minutes of prior negotiation. And then Edmund set the pen down, blotted the signature, and straightened the paper on the desk. "It is done," he said. Lord Caro laughed, a short, relieved sound, too loud for the room. "You will not regret it, Your Grace. The land in the northern valley is worth double, perhaps triple, what it seems, once the drainage improvements are." "I did not sign for the land," Edmund said. That silenced the man. He blinked. I watched his mouth open and close twice, and I thought of a fish pulled from a river and set on dry stone, confused by a world without water. "Your Grace," he managed, "then what?" "The terms are what they are." Edmund rose, already moving toward the door. "Your daughter will arrive at Haltenmere by the end of the month. The arrangement will be conducted with every propriety. I trust that is satisfactory." Lord Caro had no choice but to nod, which he did with the enthusiasm of a man who has won something he does not entirely understand, and who suspects he may have given away more than he intended. He gathered his hat and his dignity, the hat first, I noticed, and was shown out by the steward. I stayed. That was my right as Edmund's brother, and he knew it, and so did I. "You want to say something," he said, not turning from the window. "I want to say several things." "Choose one." I considered my options. I knew Edmund well enough, had known him for 36 years, since I was 4 years old and he was 10, and already conducting himself with the authority of someone twice that age, to understand which questions he would answer and which he would simply absorb in silence, like water into stone. I chose carefully. "Her father said she comes with nothing." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. "Yes," he said, "he did say that." "And you signed the contract anyway." "You have excellent hearing for a man your age." "Edmund." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the grounds of Haltenmere stretched away to the tree line, frost-hardened lawns, bare-branched elms, the winter sky the color of old pewter. A perfectly ordered world, every stone and hedge exactly where he had placed it, which was more or less how Edmund had always preferred things. "Lord Caro is a fool," he said at last, "and he has made a fool's bargain. The land claim would have unraveled in a chancery court inside of 8 months. I had Whitmore look at it. Whatever he imagines he has secured with that paper, he is wrong." He paused. "His daughter, however, is not a fool. I had occasion to observe that when she attended his last visit to the city." I remembered the girl then, the one standing at the back of the room while her father performed his various negotiations, watching everything with very dark, very calm eyes and saying almost nothing. She had been thin and simply dressed, and she had looked at Edmund's portrait above the mantel for a long time before she looked away. "She did not seem afraid of the painting," I said slowly. "No," Edmund agreed, "she did not." I have thought about that morning many times since. That was, I believe, the moment Edmund had already decided, though even he may not have known it then. Miss Caro arrived at Haltenmere on a Tuesday, in the early afternoon, in a hired conveyance that had seen better decades. I was there on the steps to receive her, because Edmund had asked me to be. He was occupied with his land agent, he said, and would meet her at dinner, though I suspected, knowing my brother, that he wanted to hear my first impression before he formed his own. She stepped down from the carriage with a composure that I found, frankly, remarkable. Her trunks were modest. Her gown was good quality but not new, carefully maintained, the sort of garment tended by someone who understands that there will not be another for some time. She had her mother's trunk, she told me later, and almost nothing else. The Caro estate had been gradually sold away over 7 years. She had watched it go, piece by piece, the way one watches a familiar coastline recede from a ship, knowing you cannot stop the distance, and so simply choosing to look clearly at what is left. None of that was visible on her face. What was visible on her face was a calm so thorough it was almost alarming, and a pair of dark eyes that moved over the front of Haltenmere with the same methodical attention she had given the portrait, taking in the stonework, the wings, the long line of windows, the worn step beneath my feet, as if she were making an inventory and intended to complete it. "You are the Duke's brother," she said. It was not a question. She had clearly done her own research. "I am Oliver Ashcraft," I bowed, "and you are Miss Caro. Welcome to Haltenmere. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was very cold," she said, "but I was well enough." "Not the journey was lovely. Thank you so much for having me. All the usual performance of arrival that young women in her position were expected to give. Simply, it was cold, but I was well enough. I liked her immediately." I showed her the house. She walked beside me with her hands folded in front of her and asked intelligent questions about the age of the east wing, about the source of the stone, about whether the walled garden was still maintained. When I told her the walled garden had been left to itself for the better part of 2 years, Edmund's last head gardener had died, and he had not yet appointed a replacement, and he found that he did not much miss the formality of it, she nodded once, thoughtfully, as if filing that away. "Does His Grace manage the kitchen garden himself?" she asked. I tried to picture Edmund kneeling in a kitchen garden and failed entirely. "He does not," I said. "Someone does," she said. "The herbs near the kitchen door are well tended. There is a person at this estate who cares about growing things. I would like to meet them." I told her that was almost certainly Mrs. Pond, the under-housekeeper, who was known to have strong opinions about rosemary. Miss Caro said that she looked forward to it. Dinner that first evening was an exercise in studied restraint on both sides. Edmund sat at the head of the table, and Miss Caro sat 3 places to his right. The arrangement had been Mrs. Barrow, the housekeeper's doing, designed to be respectful without suggesting an intimacy that had not yet been earned, and they spoke to each other with the careful precision of 2 people engaged in a formal negotiation in which neither is quite sure of the terms. He asked about her journey. She gave the same answer she had given me. It was cold. She was well enough, with the addition that the road through the valley had been worse than expected after the recent rain. He asked about her interests. She looked at him steadily and said, "That is a broad question, Your Grace." "It is." "Are you interested in a broad answer, or would you prefer to narrow it?" Edmund set down his fork. I watched him because I know my brother, and I knew that he was adjusting, that something about the directness of the question had shifted something in him, some small internal calibration, the way a compass needle swings when it detects a new north. "I would prefer," he said, "an honest one." She considered that for a moment. Then she said, "I am interested in the management of land, in the relationship between an estate's visible beauty and its productive health, which are often in conflict and rarely addressed together. I am interested in natural philosophy, insofar as I have had access to books on the subject. I am interested in the law for practical reasons that I imagine you understand." She picked up her wine glass, looked at it, set it down without drinking. "I am also, currently, interested in what you intend to do with me." The dining room was very quiet. "I intend," Edmund said, "to honor the terms of the contract." "Which are?" "That you will reside at Haltenmere, that the arrangement will be conducted with propriety, that your father's immediate debts will be discharged." He held her gaze. "And that you will be given every reasonable liberty consistent with your position here." "And what is my position here?" Another pause. Edmund, who did not pause as a rule, who said exactly what he meant in exactly the words he had chosen before he opened his mouth, paused. "That," he said, "is something I would prefer to determine carefully rather than hastily." It was, I thought, the most honest thing I had ever heard him say to a stranger. I lifted my wine glass and said nothing. She stayed. Of course she stayed, she had nowhere else to go, and she was not the sort of woman to pretend otherwise. But she stayed on her own terms, which became clear within the first week. She rose before the household. I know this because I am an early riser myself, and on the third morning I came down to find her already in the library with a candle lit, reading one of Edmund's agricultural texts with a stub of pencil in her hand and small neat notations in the margins of a piece of paper she had brought with her. She looked up when I entered, and she did not apologize for being there, or scramble to look like she was doing something less purposeful. She simply said, "Good morning," and went back to her reading. She walked the grounds every day. Not a stroll, not a decorative circuit of the lawn, a deliberate walk. The same walk in slightly different order each day, covering different portions of the estate. She asked the head groom about the paddock drainage. She asked the gamekeeper about the eastern wood. She found Mrs. Pond, and they were apparently immediate allies, because within a fortnight the walled garden had been cleared of 2 winters' worth of debris, and someone had ordered seeds. Edmund noticed. He did not say so directly, because Edmund does not say things directly if he can possibly avoid it. This is both his great strength, and, as I have told him on numerous occasions, his most significant personal failing, but I watched him watching her. I watched him pick up the paper she had left in the breakfast room, the one with her notations about the drainage in the north field, and read it carefully from top to bottom before setting it aside. He said nothing, but he did not throw it away. I dined with Edmund alone that evening. Miss Carrow had taken her meal in her room, claiming a headache, which I suspected was less headache and more the quiet withdrawal of a person who needed to think without an audience. Edmund ate with his usual efficiency and said almost nothing, and I watched him the way I always watch him when something is working in him, the slightly too careful attention to his plate, the deliberate quality of the silence. "She is not what you expected," I said. He set down his knife. What did I expect? A quiet girl who would be grateful for the arrangement and cause no inconvenience. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the fairness that was always one of his finest qualities, even when I found it infuriating, "I am not certain that is what I expected. I expected someone capable." "She is rather more than capable." "Yes," he said, "she is." He picked up his knife again. Outside, the first real snow of winter was beginning, tapping softly at the windows, and the candlelight moved in a draft from the door. "She has been managing things since she was 17, I said. "Her mother died when she was young. Her father, well, you have met her father. Someone had to keep track of what was left." I paused. The solicitor in Bath, the one who handled the estate sale, told Whitmore's man that she had presented a full accounting of the debts and assets 2 weeks before her father had even understood there was a debt to account for. She had written to 3 potential buyers. She had negotiated the first timeline herself. Edmund was looking at the window. "She was not permitted into the room for any of the final discussions, of course," I said. "She is a woman. But she had done the groundwork, and the solicitor, who was an honest man, said so. Her father took the credit." The snow was thickening. Edmund watched it, and I watched him, and the house settled around us in the way old houses do in winter, pressing itself together against the cold. "Who told you all this?" he asked. "Whitmore, who had it from the solicitor, who thought someone ought to know." Edmund looked at his plate. He ate the last of his dinner in silence, and then he pushed his chair back slightly and sat with his glass, not drinking, just holding it, the way he holds things he is thinking about. She looked at my portrait, he said at last, for 4 minutes. I know, you mentioned. I kept thinking about it, in the weeks after I met her, what she was thinking. A pause. It was unusual to wonder what someone was thinking. You don't often wonder. He considered the question with full seriousness, as he considered everything. People generally make it clear, he said, what they want from me, what they want me to think they want from me. There is rarely ambiguity. But she was ambiguous. She was not thinking about what I could give her, he said simply, or what she needed me to believe about her. She was thinking about the portrait. A long pause. She was thinking about me, the actual person, not the title. I had nothing to add to that. He went to bed shortly after, and I sat by the fire for a while, thinking about the look on his face, which was the look of a man who had been, for a very long time, alone in a way that wealth and power and an impeccably ordered estate cannot fix, and who has only just begun to understand why. The friction came, as I had expected it would, on the matter of the South Meadow. Edmund had a plan for the South Meadow. He had had the plan for 2 years, which was to drain it, level it, and bring it under formal cultivation. It was, from a purely economic standpoint, a reasonable plan. From every other standpoint, as Miss Carroll explained to him one morning in the breakfast room with the calm directness that I was coming to recognize as her natural mode, which was the mode of someone who had been talked over enough times to have decided, firmly and permanently, that she was done with being talked over. It was a catastrophic one. The South Meadow, she said, is a flood meadow. It has always been a flood meadow. The fact that it does not flood every winter does not mean it has stopped being a flood meadow. If you drain it and cultivate it, you will have 2, perhaps 3 good harvests, and then the water table will assert itself, and you will spend twice the cost of the drainage undoing it. She paused. It is also where the lapwings nest. Edmund looked at her. I am not in the habit of making agricultural decisions on the basis of lapwings. I did not say you should. I said the drainage will fail. The lapwings are a separate argument, though a valid one. She turned back to her tea. The meadow should be managed as a hay meadow, cut in late July after the breeding season, grazed lightly in autumn. It will return more consistently and with far less cost than a cultivated field on that ground. You have looked at the field. I have looked at the field. I have also looked at the estate accounts from the previous century, which your steward was kind enough to show me. The South Meadow was managed as a hay meadow until 1791. Your grandfather drained it. The drainage failed in 1798. He restored the meadow. She set down her cup. Your Grace, it is all written down. It happened before, it will happen again. Silence. Edmund looked at the table, then he looked at her. You have been reading the estate accounts, he said. I have been reading the estate accounts, she confirmed. Whitmore showed them to you. Whitmore is a sensible man. He was pleased to have someone ask. I was watching Edmund's face very carefully. What I saw there was not annoyance, though I had expected annoyance, had, in fact, braced for it, because Edmund's decisions, once made, were generally treated by Edmund as geological features rather than revisable positions. What I saw instead was something I could only describe as a kind of recognition. The expression of a man who has just realized that a conversation he expected to be simple is going to be a great deal more interesting than anticipated. I will speak with Whitmore, he said. That would be wise, she said, and poured more tea. The South Meadow was not drained. I know, because I asked Whitmore 3 weeks later, and he told me that His Grace had reviewed the historical records and revised his assessment of the project's viability. Whitmore did not say anything else, but the edges of his mouth moved in a way that suggested he had views on the subject. I am telling all of this, the breakfast room argument, the garden, the early mornings in the library, because what happened afterward did not come from nowhere. People who speak of love as though it descends suddenly like a storm have never watched it build. I have. I watched it build at Haltenmere over the course of a winter, stone by stone, the way my brother's house had been built 3 centuries before, without fanfare, without announcement, with a great deal of deliberate, unhurried care. The winter garden. This is the part I must tell carefully. There is a part of Haltenmere's grounds that faces north, a small formal enclosure that was once a physic garden, though it had long since lost its medicinal purpose and become simply a place where certain things grew because they had always grown there and the house had never troubled them. Lavender, gone woody and sprawling. A damask rose that survived every winter and bloomed every spring with a stubbornness that Edmund said he found both admirable and irritating. A stone bench against the south-facing wall where the winter sun, on the days when it appeared, pooled briefly in the early afternoon. I found them there, both of them, without apparent plan, on a January afternoon when the ground was white with frost, and the sky had gone that particular pale blue that only appears in cold weather, so bright it almost hurt to look at. I was on my way back from the kitchen garden and I stopped in the archway, because I am not entirely without discretion, and I stood very still. Miss Carroll was on the bench, her hands wrapped around something I could not see at first, a small pot, I realized, a terracotta pot with a cutting in it. Edmund was standing a few feet away with his coat on and his breath misting in the cold air, and they were talking. Not the careful negotiation of dinner, not the direct but defended exchange of the breakfast room. They were talking the way people talk when they have forgotten to protect themselves. It was my mother's, she was saying. A rose, a particular variety, she grew it in the walled garden at home. When it became clear the estate would be sold, I took a cutting. I kept it alive for 2 years in a hired room in Bath. Edmund looked at the small pot she was holding. In Bath, he said. In a south-facing window. The landlady was not pleased about the soil. She smiled, the first full smile I had seen from her, and it changed her face entirely, made it bright and sudden and young. I would like to plant it here, if that would be permitted. It would be permitted, Edmund said. He sounded strange. His voice was very even, very controlled, and that was, with Edmund, often the sign of something that was not even and not controlled at all happening underneath. Where would you put it? Against that wall. She nodded toward the south-facing stone. It needs warmth and shelter. It would do well there. Then it should go there. She looked up at him. The smile had faded to something quieter, something more careful. You did not have to sign that contract, she said. It was not an accusation. It was the directness she always applied to things. The directness of someone who does not see the point in leaving important things unspoken. Edmund did not look away. No, he said. My father told you I came with nothing. He did. And you signed it anyway. I did. A pause. The winter light sat on the white ground between them and made everything very still. Why? She asked. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because the first time I met you, you looked at my portrait for 4 minutes and then looked away without expression, and I found I could not stop thinking about what you had concluded. She stared at him. And he continued, with the painstaking care of a man constructing something he is afraid to break. I observed that you were the only person in your father's drawing room who was paying attention to what was actually happening, and not to what everyone wished to appear to be happening. And I thought, he stopped. What did you think? She asked softly. I thought, he said, that I was very tired of people who were not paying attention. I backed away from the archway then. I am his brother, not his keeper, and there are limits to what a man ought to witness, even especially when what he is witnessing is the finest thing he has seen in 36 years. Lord Aldricourt arrived in February. I must tell you about Lord Aldricourt, because without him the rest of this story would be simply a quiet unfolding, which it nearly was, and which I think both Edmund and Miss Carroll might have preferred. But the world has a tendency to interfere in quiet things, and Lord Aldricourt was precisely the sort of interference that the world produces when it wishes to remind you that there are always men who built their comfort on other people's wreckage, and who dislike very much when the wreckage fails to stay conveniently wrecked. Aldricourt was the man who had purchased the Caro estate. Not directly. Nothing Aldricourt did was done directly, but through a series of intermediaries and pressure applied through a solicitor to Lord Caro's creditors at a time when Lord Caro was in no position to refuse anything. He had then engineered the land claim that had brought Edmund to the table in the first place, the claim that Whitmore had told Edmund would unravel in Chancery in 8 months, which was true, but which had served its purpose. It had given Aldricourt the leverage to force a contract that would tie Haltenmere's resources to the situation, or so he had intended. What he had not accounted for was Edmund signing for reasons of his own. He arrived on a gray February morning with 2 men I did not recognize, and a manner that managed to be simultaneously unctuous and threatening, which is a difficult combination to achieve, and is generally the mark of someone who has spent a great deal of time practicing it. Edmund received him in the formal drawing-room, which was Edmund's way of saying, "This is not a friendly visit, and I am not pretending otherwise. I was there. Miss Caro was there because Edmund had asked her to be, which told me something important about where things stood." Aldricourt was surprised to see her. He covered it quickly, too quickly, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and directed his greeting to Edmund, as if she were not in the room. This was, I suspected, precisely what he had always done with her, and with her mother before her, and with anyone who stood in a room but could not defend themselves. The world contains many men like Aldricourt. They are experts at the specific art of looking through people. "Your Grace," he said, with a bow that suggested the form of deference without any of the content, "I hope I find you well, and Miss Caro," a pause, the kind of pause that carries a weight. "How unexpected." "Is it?" she said. He blinked. He had not expected her to answer. "I live here," she said. "It seems unlikely that my presence at Haltenmere would be unexpected to anyone who had made it their business to understand the situation." Aldricourt's smile thinned. He turned back to Edmund. "I had hoped to speak with you on a matter of mutual interest, Your Grace, relating to the original land claim and certain revisions that might be to the benefit of all parties." "Speak then," Edmund said. "What Aldricourt proposed, and I will spare you the ornamental language in which he wrapped it, the layers of courtesy and implication that took 20 minutes to say what could have been said in 2, was this: that the contract between Edmund and Lord Caro should be understood as a purely practical instrument, not a personal commitment, and that its conditions might be satisfied in a manner more flexible than their literal reading suggested, in exchange for Edmund's support in a separate matter of land management in the Eastern Valley, which Aldricourt happened to also have an interest in. What he meant was, Miss Caro's position at Haltenmere was a formality, and Edmund could dispose of it as he liked, and Aldricourt would be very grateful for the flexibility. He said all of this while Miss Caro was in the room. He said it while looking at Edmund, in the manner of men who have decided that the woman is a piece being moved rather than a person who moves. I watched Edmund through all of it. His face did not change. The precise, controlled stillness that he wore as a matter of course stayed perfectly in place, and I cannot tell you how many years it took me to learn that the very stillness of him was the signal, that the calmer Edmund appeared, the more significant the thing happening underneath. When Aldricourt finished, Edmund was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "No." Aldricourt smiled as if he had misheard. "Your Grace, I don't think you have fully." "I said no," Edmund said. "I said it once. I intend to say it only once more. The contract will be honored in its entirety. Miss Caro's position at Haltenmere is not a formality. It is not a negotiating instrument. It is not available for your revision or mine." He stood, and when Edmund stood in a room, the room acknowledged it. The land claim you engineered will fail in chancery. Whitmore has already prepared the relevant documents. Whatever you imagined you had leveraged into existence, you are mistaken." Aldricourt's face had changed. The unctuous warmth was gone, and what was underneath it was less pleasant. The look of a man who has had his hand slapped and is deciding whether to be angry about it. "You are making an error," he said, with the precision of someone who is genuinely accustomed to having that statement produce results. "I have made errors," Edmund said. "This is not one of them." Aldricourt looked briefly, unwisely at Miss Caro. There was something in it, some last attempt to dismiss or diminish her, some final act of that specific cruelty men like him perform without thinking, as reflex, as habit. The look that says, "Whatever you imagine you have here, it is not secure, and I am the reason it is not secure." She met it without blinking. I saw Edmund see that. I saw him see the way she held herself, the absolute stillness of her, the dark eyes that did not waver, the composure of someone who had been looked at that way for years and had decided, at some point, that she would not be moved by it. I saw something happen in him that had no name I could easily give, but that I recognized the shape of. He crossed the room and stood beside her, and the movement was so quiet and so deliberate that it took Aldricourt a moment to register what had occurred. That the Duke of Haltenmere had stepped away from his fireplace and placed himself, without ceremony, at the shoulder of a woman who came with nothing. "I believe we are finished," Edmund said. "Barrow will show you out." Aldricourt left. He said two more things on his way to the door, neither of which I will record here because they did not deserve the dignity of being remembered. The door closed. The house was very quiet. Miss Caro did not move for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you." "There is nothing to thank," Edmund said. He was still standing beside her. He had not moved away. "It should not have been necessary." "No," she said, "it should not." She looked at him, "But you did it anyway." The words landed oddly, and I realized after a moment that they were the same words she had said to him in the winter garden about the contract. "And you signed it anyway." The same shape. A different meaning, or perhaps the same meaning, deepened. Edmund looked at her for a long time in the gray February light of the drawing room, and then he said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said I would do it again, and again after that, as many times as it required. She did not look away. Her eyes had gone very bright. "That," she said very softly, "is a significant statement." "Yes," he said, "it is. There is something I ought to tell you about, before I get to the week that followed, because it is part of the shape of things and I want the shape to be complete." 3 days after Aldricourt left, Edmund received a call from Lady Fenwick, who was one of the significant figures in the county's social architecture. A woman of 60, with the precision of a fine watch and the warmth of one, who had known Edmund since his childhood and who had opinions about everything, delivered with the cheerfulness of someone who has long since stopped worrying about whether her opinions are welcome. She came with her niece, which was Lady Fenwick's way of softening visits that were not entirely social. The niece was a prop, a source of harmless conversation, a reason for the visit that was not the actual reason for the visit. I knew this because Lady Fenwick had called on us 3 times in my life with similar staging, always when something in the county required her attention. She wanted to see Miss Caro. That was the actual reason. Edmund understood this, and he brought Miss Caro into the drawing room with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided that something is going to happen and intends to make sure it happens correctly. Lady Fenwick looked at Miss Caro the way she looked at everything, directly, without hostility, but with an assessment so thorough you could practically hear it running. Miss Caro, for her part, looked back in exactly the same way, which seemed to surprise Lady Fenwick, because her expression shifted slightly, a fractional upward movement at the corner of her mouth, like a door opening a crack. Lord Carrow's daughter, Lady Fenwick said, not cruelly, simply placing her. Yes, Miss Carrow said, though I confess I have generally found the connection less useful than one might hope. Lady Fenwick laughed a genuine laugh, short and surprised. Yes, I imagine you have. She set her cup down. I have heard something of your situation, my dear. The county talks, as you may have discovered. I have discovered it, Miss Carrow said. I imagine what they are saying is not entirely flattering. I imagine it is not. I have not heard it directly, as yet. You will, Lady Fenwick said, with the brisk honesty of someone who considers kindness and clarity the same thing. There are those who will say the match is irregular, that the circumstances were irregular, that a woman in your position ought to have better understood the irregularity of it and declined. She looked at Miss Carrow steadily. What will you say to them? Miss Carrow considered this. Then she said, I will say that the circumstances were what they were, and that the match is what it has become, which is something different from what it began as. And I will say it once clearly, and then I will find the conversation very dull and move on to something more interesting. There was a beat of silence. Good, said Lady Fenwick. That is exactly right. She picked up her cup again. You will find, my dear, that most people who raise such objections do so because they enjoy raising objections, and the surest way to extinguish the enjoyment is to give them nothing to push against. She glanced at Edmund, who had said nothing throughout this exchange, and who wore the expression of a man watching something he had bet on performing exactly as expected. Your Grace shall do. Edmund said, I know. Lady Fenwick left 2 hours later with her niece and an invitation to dinner, which she accepted, and within the week she had made it known, with the efficiency of someone who understands that information is a social instrument and ought to be used purposefully, that she considered the Haltenmere match entirely satisfactory, which in that county was roughly equivalent to a papal declaration. I am not saying this solved everything. Society has its own pace and its own stubbornness, and there were those who maintained their objections for months, and a few who maintained them indefinitely, which is the right of anyone with a sufficiently empty calendar. But it set the register. It said, this is not an embarrassment to be managed. This is a household in order. Miss Carrow thanked Lady Fenwick afterward privately, in a note that Lady Fenwick showed me later with considerable satisfaction. It was brief and sincere, and contained no performance. Lady Fenwick said it was the best letter she had received in 15 years, which I believe was accurate. There is a week in February, the week after Aldricourt's visit, that I will describe only in brief, because it belongs to the two of them and not to me. What I can tell you, because I was there, present in the house if not in the rooms where the important things were happening, is this. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone who did not know it well would have noticed, but Haltenmere had a quality, all old houses do, I believe, of reflecting the interior weather of the people who lived in it. And in that week something in it settled, the way ground settles after a frost, pressing down into itself and becoming more solid. On the evening of Aldricourt's departure, Edmund came to find me in the billiard room, which was unusual, because Edmund only visited the billiard room when he wanted to talk about something without appearing to want to talk about something. He picked up a cue, examined it, set it down, and said, without preamble, I am going to ask her to stay. I waited. Not as a matter of the contract, he said. The contract is a piece of paper. It describes a situation. It does not describe what the situation has become, and I am disinclined to allow a piece of paper to continue governing something that has gone well beyond its scope. He looked at the billiard table for a moment, at the arrangement of the balls on the green baize, with the focused attention he applied to things when he was, in fact, thinking about something else entirely. I am aware that this may not be what she wants. She has made no indication. She has made considerable indication, I said. He looked up. Edmund, I said, she argued with you about a meadow. She showed you her mother's rose cutting. She reads your agricultural texts at 6 in the morning and makes notations. I paused. She stood in that drawing room this afternoon and looked at Aldricourt the way you look at a problem that is beneath your concern. She was not afraid. She was inhabiting this house. She has been inhabiting it since the second week. I looked at my brother. I say this as the person who has known you the longest. She is not indifferent. Edmund was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the careful way of someone testing the weight of words before committing to them, "She deserves to be asked, properly, without the contract as the context." "Yes," I said, "she does. She deserves to have the choice." "Yes." He nodded once, as if something had been confirmed, and left the billiard room without taking a shot. I stood there for a moment, and then I put the cue away and went to bed, and I slept better than I had in some time, which I attribute to the particular relief of watching someone you love do the right thing of their own accord, without needing to be told. The days that followed were the quietest and the fullest I had known at Haltenmere. The kind of days where a great deal is happening in the negative space, in the pauses between conversations, in the way two people in the same room move without collision, the small adjustments of two people who have begun, without discussing it, to make room for each other. Edmund and Miss Carroll walked the south meadow together and marked the places where the lapwings had nested the previous spring. They had dinner in the small dining room instead of the formal one, because the small dining room was warmer and neither of them particularly wanted to be formal, which was the first time in 10 years I had seen Edmund voluntarily choose comfort over ceremony. He showed her his library properly, not the tour one gives a guest but the private accounting, the books he actually read, the section on natural philosophy where he had made his own marginal notes, which Miss Carroll read with a focused attention that delighted him. She showed him the rose cutting and explained what would be needed to transplant it successfully. They talked about her mother's estate, not with the careful distance of a report but the careful closeness of a grief, the estate she had grown up in, the rooms she had known as a child, the garden her mother had built over 20 years and that had been broken up and sold with everything else. She did not cry. She was not the sort of woman who cried easily, and she did not apologize for the fact that her eyes were wet at the edges. She simply told him, and he listened in the way he listened to things that mattered, which was the way of someone who does not look away. He told her about his own losses, which surprised me, because Edmund did not tell people about losses. He told her about their father, who had died when Edmund was 19, and who had left him a title and an estate, and no clear instruction on how to be either the duke or the man, and how he had spent 15 years trying to build the certainty on the outside that he had never quite managed to feel on the inside, and how tiring it had become. Miss Carroll said that she understood exactly what he meant, and I believe she did. The rose cutting was planted in the second week of March, against the south-facing wall of the Physic Garden. Edmund was there for the planting, not because anyone had asked him to be, but because he had simply appeared in his coat with his hands in his pockets, and stood watching with the grave attention he gave to things he considered important. Mrs. Pond was there, and she had strong opinions about the depth of the planting hole, and Miss Carroll had strong opinions about it as well, and they argued in the companionable way of two people who respect each other enough to disagree, while Edmund watched and said nothing and looked like a man who is remembering something. When it was done and the soil was firmed around the cutting, Miss Carroll stood and pressed the dirt from her hands and looked at the wall where the rose would grow in spring and through the summer, and for every summer after that, year after year, the same rose that had grown in her mother's garden, and Edmund, standing a foot away with his hands still in his pockets, said very quietly, "It will do well there." "Yes," she said. "I think it will." They looked at each other. I was, once again, standing in an archway. I am beginning to think I should find a different hobby. Edmund proposed on a Wednesday in the library, which was not remotely romantic as a setting, but was, when I thought about it, exactly right for both of them, because the library was the place where they had both been most themselves. The place where she had read his books at 6 in the morning with a pencil in her hand. The place where he had shown her his own marginal notes. The place where the best of both of them had been most legible. He told me about it afterward in his characteristic way, spare on detail, precise on what mattered. He had gone to the library in the late afternoon, when the winter light came gold and low through the west windows and the fire was fully banked, and she had been there already in the chair beside the window, with a book closed in her lap and her eyes on the garden outside, which was what she often did at that hour, not reading, not working, simply looking at the garden as if checking that it was still there, that the things planted in it were still growing, that the ground was still holding. He had stood in the doorway for a moment. She had not turned. And then he had come in and sat down in the chair across from her, which was the chair he generally read in, and they had been still together for a few minutes in the way that two people can be still together when they have stopped needing to fill the silence. He had said, "The contract your father signed is a piece of paper." She had set her book aside. He had said, "Pieces of paper have their uses. They describe situations. They create obligations. They provide a legal frame for things that would otherwise have no frame, but they are not the thing they describe. And I find that the thing it was intended to describe, the situation I agreed to, the arrangement, the terms, is not the thing that has actually come to exist here. What has come to exist here is something the contract has no language for." She had looked at him steadily and said nothing, which was, he told me, what gave him the courage to continue. He had said, "I am asking you, separately from the contract and without reference to it, whether you would be willing to stay at Haltenmere, not as a matter of the arrangement, not because a piece of paper has told you to, but as my wife, because I want you here, and I have wanted you here since before I entirely understood what wanting meant, and I would like, very much, to have the opportunity to spend the rest of my life giving you reasons to stay that have nothing to do with your father's debts." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, "I will need a moment to think." He had said, "Of course." She had thought by his account, because he had timed it, which is entirely Edmund, for approximately 45 seconds. He had sat and watched the fire and tried to breathe in a manner consistent with dignity, which he said was the hardest 45 seconds of his life. Then she had said, "Yes." He had asked what she had been thinking in those 45 seconds. She had told him she was reviewing the evidence. He had said, and the evidence was sufficient. She had said, the evidence was. She had paused, and her voice had had something in it he had not heard before, something warm and undefended, more than sufficient, she said. Quite overwhelming, actually, if one wished to be precise about it. He had not said anything else. There are moments that do not require words, and Edmund, who chose his words with such care, understood this better than most. I have since asked her what she was thinking in those 45 seconds. She told me she was reviewing the evidence, which I found entirely characteristic, and which Edmund, when I told him, found so funny that he laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that I had not heard from him in years, that made him look like the boy he had been at 10 before the title and the weight of things had settled on him. She did that for him. She gave him that back. The household knew within the day, because households always know. This is one of the immutable laws of the universe, like the tendency of water to flow downhill or the tendency of Mrs. Pond to have opinions. There was no announcement. There was simply a shift in the quality of the air at Haltenmere, a warmth that had not been there before, and Mrs. Barrow, who had served the house for 30 years, told the under-butler with a decisive nod that she had known from the first week. The under-butler told me this. I told him I had suspected from somewhat earlier. Edmund wrote to Lord Carrow himself, because Edmund would not delegate a thing simply to avoid the discomfort of doing it. He wrote to inform him that the terms of the contract were being superseded by a formal proposal of marriage, which Lord Caro accepted with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been holding his breath since February. He wrote 2 other letters as well, which I know about because he told me, though he did not show them to me. The first was to Whitmore, instructing him to proceed with the Chancery filing at his earliest convenience. The second was to Aldricourt's solicitor, informing him that the Duke of Haltenmere considered the matter of the Eastern Valley entirely closed. The spring came. It always does. That is the one thing about winters, however long, however gray, that you can rely upon. The frost-hardened ground softened. The bare-limbed elms put out their first small green. The lapwings returned to the south meadow, exactly where Miss Caro had said they would, and Edmund walked out to look at them on a morning in April, and came back with mud on his boots, and something on his face that I had no word for, but that I recognized as belonging to the category of things that are, in the fullest sense, good. The rose put out leaves in early April. She saw it first on a morning walk, and came inside to tell Edmund with a directness that allowed for no ceremony. She simply put her head around the library door and said, "It's leafing," and Edmund set down his correspondence and stood up, and that was the end of the morning's work. They were married in May, in the village church at the edge of the Haltenmere estate, where the Ashcraft family had been married for 4 generations. It was a small ceremony, which was both their preferences. She had no taste for performance, and Edmund had spent enough of his life being looked at, which is the tax that power levies on the people who carry it, and he had been paying it since he was 19. The guests were those who mattered, the household who had earned it, the vicar, who had known Edmund since boyhood and who was not above the occasional expression of personal satisfaction, Lady Fenwick, who had decided she was attending and had not asked permission, myself as his witness, and Mrs. Pond, who had secured the 3rd pew and wept throughout the entire ceremony with the wholehearted efficiency she brought to everything, and who subsequently denied it with an absolutely straight face. The church was small and old and smelled of stone and candles, and the early roses that someone had arranged at the ends of the pews, small bunches of deep pink blooms, which I recognized as being from the Physic garden wall, from the cutting that had survived 2 winters in Bath. I do not know who had cut them. I suspect Mrs. Pond, who denied this as well. She walked up the aisle without her father's arm. Lord Caro had been invited, and had accepted, and had then sent his excuses 2 days before on account of an indisposition that I suspect was primarily the indisposition of a man who does not know how to look his daughter in the face after what the previous 6 months had revealed about the both of them. She did not seem troubled by this. She walked with the ease of a person who is accustomed to doing things without assistance, who has learned that the lack of it is not a loss, but simply the condition of getting on with what needs to be done. Her gown was ivory silk with a high neck and long sleeves, very clean and very simple, the kind of garment that draws no attention to itself because everything about it is exactly right. At her wrist, tied with a narrow ribbon, the spray of flowers from the Physic garden, lavender and those first rose blooms, deep pink, the color her mother had grown and brought to England in a clay pot from a garden, no one would have troubled to save but her. Edmund stood at the front of the church and watched her come. He did not look at anything else, not once. From the moment she appeared in the church doorway to the moment she reached his side, his eyes did not move from her face. I watched him because I always watch him, and what I saw was the face of a man who has stopped performing stillness and simply arrived at it, who was not managing himself, not making calculations, not carrying the weight of the title and the house and the 15 years of careful architecture he had built around himself. He was just there, watching her walk toward him, with an expression of such complete and undefended attention that I had to look away for a moment, because it was the most private thing I had ever seen on a public face. I thought of what he had told me that winter evening at the window, that he was very tired of people who were not paying attention, and I thought that this was what it looks like on a person who has always been precise. Love that is not diffuse or approximate but exact, complete, the full weight of a very careful mind brought to bear on a single thing. She reached him. He took her hand in both of his, and the formal caution he usually kept between himself and the world was simply not there. She looked up at him with those dark, attending eyes, and I saw her face do something that it almost never did in company. It opened. Not the controlled composure, not the careful steadiness. Something unguarded and clear, like a room with all the curtains drawn back. The vicar said the words. Edmund said I will in the tone he uses for all commitments, quiet and absolute, and requiring no emphasis because the certainty behind them does the work. She said I will with her eyes on his face and her hand very still in his, and the steadiness in her was not the steadiness of someone protecting herself, not the composure of a woman who has learned to hold herself carefully because no one else was going to. It was a different steadiness. The steadiness of someone who has found ground solid enough to stand on without bracing. And that was that. I am writing this some years later, 3 years, to be precise, which is enough time for the South Meadow to have proved itself, and for the rose against the Physic garden wall to be climbing the full height of the stone, and for the household of Haltenmere to have expanded in ways that I will not detail here, except to say that Mrs. Pond's position has been significantly upgraded in terms of the garden she now superintends, and that Whitmore has stopped looking like a man who is bracing for impact. Aldricourt is no longer a concern. The Chancery filing was everything Whitmore said it would be, and the Eastern Valley matter resolved without Haltenmere's involvement, in a direction that I imagine Aldricourt did not prefer. These things happen. What I find myself returning to when I think about my brother and his wife is not the drama of it, not Aldricourt's visit, not the contract, not even the winter garden, though that is the image I return to most. What I find myself returning to is the breakfast room on a morning in December, before any of this had resolved itself, when Miss Caro was sitting across from the most feared man in 3 counties with her teacup in her hand, looking at him with those very calm dark eyes, and telling him with complete certainty that he was wrong about the South Meadow. And the way he had looked at her, the way his face had done that thing, that small internal adjustment, the compass needle swinging to find a new north. I think that was when it happened. I think that was the moment he signed a different contract, one with no paper, no lawyer, no seal, the kind that cannot be revoked because it is written in something that has no dissolution clause. My brother is not a demonstrative man. He will tell you himself if you ask. That feeling is a private matter and expression of it, a luxury that the management of an estate and a title does not often accommodate. But I have seen him walk out to the Physic garden in the early mornings when the light is very new and the frost is still on the grass, and I have seen the way he looks at the rose against the wall, the one cutting that survived 2 winters in a hired room in Bath, that came to Haltenmere with nothing and has since climbed, unhurried and magnificent, to the full height of the stone, and I know what I am looking at. He would do it again, he told her, as many times as it required. He meant it. He always means what he says. That is, along with everything else, what she knew when she said yes, and it is why she was right. She came with nothing, her father said. He was wrong about that too, as it turned out. He was wrong in the particular way that men who do not pay attention are always wrong. He had been looking at accounts when he should have been looking at his daughter. Edmund was paying attention. He always has been at the things that matter. And so has she. That is, I think, the whole of it. That is the thing I watched, from doorways and breakfast rooms and archways on cold mornings, across one winter and into a spring and all the years that followed. 2 people who were, in their different ways, very good at paying attention, who had both, in their different ways, been underestimated by the world and had decided not to be reduced by it, finding each other in a house that was built for exactly this kind of permanence. The contract that began it was ink on paper. What replaced it cannot be revoked. I was there the morning he signed it, and I remember thinking, he did not sign for the land. I know now what he signed for. I'm not sure he knew it himself entirely in that moment, but I think some part of him did. Some part of Edmund, even then, was paying attention. He always was.